Welcome to the Integrated Activism slideshow. I recently released a book called Integrated Activism. It was published by North Atlantic Publishers out of California. The full title is Integrated Activism: Applying the Hidden Connections Between Ecology, Economics, Politics, and Social Progress. The purpose of this slideshow, I'm going to do one slideshow that's an overview of the whole book and of the philosophy, ideas, activities behind the book. And then I'm going to do a slideshow for each chapter. So this slideshow is the overview slideshow. This is the only slide, I promise, that is nothing but text. All of the rest of them are more interesting, I hope. So this is the table of contents. The first chapter is called Our Story. It's an introduction to the concept of agency and how history is interpreted, how the future is interpreted, in terms of who moves history, who pretends to move history, and what really moves history, how things really change, how human culture actually evolves as opposed to how it's said to evolve by various political, religious, academic leaders. That's important. Going into the second chapter, The Rise and Fall of Liberal Democracy, we see democracy and freedom, the extent to which we have a democratic society, as being the products of our own mental, political movements. The purpose of this chapter is try to put democracy and democratic development into a historical, ecological, economic context. The third chapter, What the Heck is Going On in South Dakota, has to do with women's rights, the civil liberties that women possess. They have increased and declined in various places around the world and in the United States. Why does that happen? That chapter looks at that. Peak oil, biofuel, and genocide. Inasmuch as I believe that ecology and economy have a powerful impact on the evolution of culture, understanding the impacts of availability of traditional fossil fuel supplies as well as new and old biofuel supplies, and how that relates to our future going forward is an important issue. Throughput, annihilation equals economic vitality, looks at the economic relationships of economic stimulus from consumerism, how that relates to the evolution of our value system, and what that means for developing a coherent, environmentally minded future. Wars that were never meant to be won, inasmuch as democracy is going to face stress from economic and ecological factors, then understanding how our culture chooses to define evil, how it defines and responds to those evils, is important. Why large groups of people do foolish things. Why is it that we can be intelligent at the individual level, and yet on the large scale our culture is blind to its own future? Is that an accident? I think it's a fairly systematic process, and this chapter looks at that process historically and going forward. Science in spite of the evidence looks at social sciences, why they have chosen to look at or not look at various aspects of cross-cultural and social reality as it relates to the ecological and economic underpinnings of human cultural evolution. Good environmentalism and bad, what works, what doesn't, and why. These last three chapters are essentially looking at solutions, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This chapter describes itself. It looks at good, effective environmentalism and political environmentalism. If we believe that a new, sustainably oriented economy is going to be the basis of a future sustainably oriented culture, this chapter begins to fish out what pieces of what we have done so far or what we are doing work and what pieces don't work. Addressing the root causes of ecological catastrophe and non-conscious culture. This pulls together the various aspects of economy, of child rearing, of education, of how we have done things and how we need to do things differently to create a conscious culture. And the second great leap looks at it in the broader anthropological context, how human cultural evolution has worked in the past, how it can work in the future. So, looking at the first chapter then, again, this is an outline, this is an overview, so we're going to go through all of this fairly quickly, and then we're going to go back and do a slideshow for each chapter. Cultural dissonance is a term that I coined to refer to those situations where human cultures make up stories and otherwise choose to purposefully not understand those things that are difficult. In the social realm, every human culture knows what it chooses to know and does not know what it chooses to not know. You see this when you look at ethnography. Circumstances which very predictably trigger this kind of cultural dissonance are issues like warfare and infanticide. When one village-level culture chooses to go to war with another village-level culture, they make up explanations just like we do in modern times that kind of dehumanize the enemy or rationalize the necessity of war. Infanticide is a loaded word, and it's a bit hard without explaining a lot of ethnography to get some perspective on the fact that our culture is not more humane than pre-industrial cultures, but in fact pre-industrial cultures did practice infanticide far more often than happens in modern times. It was quite common. And there again, it's an emotionally difficult thing, so people generate rationalizations. There's a dissonance, a social level dissonance between stated moral beliefs or emotional values and what people feel compelled to do. So stepping forward to our time, what causes dissonance in our time? Well, there are a few primary areas beyond the old areas, such as warfare. What causes dissonance in our time? One of the biggest issues is poverty and polarization, the fact that some people have so very much wealth and so many people still live in abject poverty. That generates a great dissonance in our time, and we come up with all sorts of rationalizations and false explanations to explain why that is true. Unsustainability and the inevitable contraction of the industrial economy is another major source of dissonance. It's something that is obvious and inevitable and yet never discussed openly in the media, or very rarely, or on the evening news. You won't hear the word contraction or collapse, or at least not very often, extremely rarely. And yet when you look at the growth rates, that particular curve on the left is a population growth curve, but all of the curves for everything we consume and produce are a similar parabolic curve these days, for the most part. And a curve like that simply can't go up forever. That's no more than common sense. And we've created this big industrial society, one picture of it there on the right. Can't go on forever. But we have generated a great deal of, it generates dissonance, it generates this social level discomfort to talk about these things. So we rationalize, we step around it, we come up with ways of not thinking about it in a rational or scientific fashion. The most overarching, the broadest, most overarching source of dissonance, and this reaches, the previous two issues are at least looked at by various advocacy groups. Various populists, try to organize the poor or disadvantaged groups to gain more rights. There's certainly a lot of environmental groups that try to organize around environmental issues. But the big overarching issue that there has no advocacy group is the dominating power of ecology and economy over the evolution of human culture. The Earth-Mind connection, as I have called it in some places and times. If you look at ethnography around the world, there's a very clear and strong link between ecological, economic circumstances and how human cultures evolve. This is a couple of images here that display that. On the left we have Dagon, which is a fish god from ancient times that the people who now lived in Lebanon, the area that we call Lebanon, used to worship. And as you can see, it has the body of a fish, the arms and legs of a human. And I ask people, what did these people, where did they live? Oh, they lived near the ocean. What did they do to make a living? Well, they caught fish. That's really obvious. And yet if you look at modern religious political symbolism, that connection from ecology, meaning we live near the ocean, to economy, we catch fish, to religious or political symbolism, we don't see that our own culture that way. It's because it's humiliating. It's easy to look at other cultures in which we have no particular investment and understand these very practical material connections, but for us, we don't want to see ourselves in those terms. The image on the right is of a corn god from Central America, also an ancient deity, not surprisingly from those cultures in Central America that created corn, and corn became very much the staple, the mainstay of their society. Not surprisingly, they have deities that incorporate ears of corn. Why is the Earth-Mind connection so threatening? Well, who are all these people we're looking at here? There are a bunch of philosophers on the left and more philosophers up on the right, and political leaders. There's Mr. Obama, and I believe that's the Pope on the lower right. What do all of these people have in common? Well, the mythology is that they drive the evolution of human culture forward, and you do not. This is the mythology we've created. It's a very top-down view of things. It's really a flat Earth belief system that we've developed. If you look around you, you see the world is flat. It's pretty obvious. You know, maybe there's some local hilliness, but you look out over the horizon and over the long view, it's flat. Completely obvious, undeniable, and completely wrong. How do we know it's wrong? Well, you have to get up higher to a broader perspective to look at, you know, the broader globe, and you start to realize that what seems obvious in a small perspective is completely wrong in a bigger perspective. And this is precisely true with the Earth-Mind connection. In the immediate political sense, we think of these leaders as having so much power, as driving the evolution of human values, of human beliefs, of human politics, of human culture, driving it forward. It just isn't true. The reality is that the evolution of how human beings relate to their environment, how they extract an economy from that environment, has an overwhelming and dominating influence on our political systems, our belief systems, our personal belief systems, our religious systems, and our religious ethics. All of those things that the leaders ascribed really have much deeper roots. But the thing about this is it stretches across left, right, academic, political, because leftist academics, if there is such a thing, are as vested in their own claims of false agency generally as are right-wing politicians. It's universal that people in positions of leadership tend to exaggerate greatly their impact on history. And as a result of now thousands of years of hearing those exaggerations, we have developed a culture that is utterly devoid of an understanding of its own evolution. We cannot see ourselves in the mirror. We do not understand what drives human evolution forward. We don't understand where it came from. We don't understand where it's going. We'll talk about this more as we go along. So the next chapter in the book is about democracy, the work of great white men, or a product of empire. Democracy, its economic and ecological context are fairly easy to understand, fairly transparent if you simply really go and look for them. And this is an overview. We're not going to dig into the issue deeply right now. We'll do that in the next slideshow. But if you look at democracy, there's the ancient Greek Parthenon, I believe it is, on the left slide, and there's Augustus on the right slide from ancient Rome, who was the last of the Caesars to, the first of the Caesars, to transform Roman society from being a limited democracy back into being a dictatorship. And of course we have a modern parliament in the bottom picture. What we don't understand is that these democracies, so-called, have always been oligarchic in nature, and historically they've been a product of empire. It's been a ruling business class in each one of these civilizations that has come together and formed a limited democracy for their own ends. And the relationship of democracy and fascism, democracy and totalitarianism, is also well worth looking at. It is not purely a product of politics. There are much deeper roots, and what that means for our past and our future we need to understand in much greater depth if we want to have a democratic future. The advancement of women. When do social movements succeed? When do they fail? The answer to that question is closely related to the prior chapter, which is democracy, about democracy. Democracy is the process by which economically empowered persons express that power in the political forum. We tend to think of the modern triumph of feminism, of women's expansion of political rights, as being a mental political triumph. And we tend to think of it in linear terms, like the past was dark when women were excessively feminized, as per the picture on the left, and thought to be frail and excluded from politics and limited in their civil and legal liberties, to the modern growth of the modern feminist movement, which we see on the right, in conjunction with an expansion of legal, political, economic standing of women in modern society. The history of it is far more complex than that. Women's rights have expanded and contracted in various ways in various human cultures around the world, including in modern industrial society. It has not been a process of linear change. There has been many ups and downs. and understanding the process by which economically empowered persons express the power that they gain over time, how that affects the evolution of women's rights, civil liberties for minorities, is important, both in terms of understanding our past and understanding where we're going in the future. So if we accept that this Earth-Mind connection has an overwhelming and largely hidden power, if we accept that it has a large and largely hidden and overwhelming power over the evolution of democracy, then the availability of energy in modern industrial society is a critical issue. Energy allows us to overcome many local environmental limits. Of course, there's a lot of pollution connected with fossil fuel energy sources. But if we believe that resource availability dominates the evolution of our culture, we have to talk about the influence of dirt and oil. The graph there on the left is the production of oil. The falling dark blue curve at the base of that graph is the old oil wells that produce most of our oil, and they are in a fairly relentless collapse right now. We're producing a lot of unconventional oil, but it takes more energy to produce that unconventional oil than it does traditional oil. The picture at the bottom is a modern biofuel system, a chipper system. It's actually used for biofuel and paper and all sorts of things. Anyway, processing trees on an industrial scale, we think of that, oh, that's a new idea, maybe we can make energy that way. The picture on the right is a log hauler that dates back to the 1800s. We think of biofuel as being a new idea. Biofuel is not an exit, a solution to the modern energy crisis. The modern energy crisis has been having powerful and unseen influences on our democracy, on the evolution of civil rights, on women's rights. The current form of biofuel utilization is not going to help that process. In fact, if anything, it's going to make it worse. And going forward, we need to understand the relationship of fossil fuel, biofuel, and how that the limitations or availability of these resources impact the evolution of our culture, of our democracy, of our civil liberties, past, present, and future. Of course, talking about energy sources begs the question, why do we need so much energy? Well, it's to drive this crazy industrial consumer economy forward. So many environmental books just say, oh, environmentalism, the cause of our environmental problems is just simple human greed. They just kind of say that. Oh, of course people are greedy and consumptive. That's just human nature. But it begs the question, does greed cause consumerism, or does the economic stimulus push the evolution of our culture to value greed? We've turned history upside down, and we've taken malleable human values, such as greed. People can be very greedy or altruistic, and this really comes through if you read much ethnography. There are many human cultures, historically probably most, who valued altruistic group-serving behavior rather than self-serving behavior. In our time, we have developed an industrial economy that produces way too much stuff, and we have to consume it, we have to use it up to stimulate the economy. The name for that is throughput. It's driven by this crazy commercial system. You can see all the logos and whatnot on the left there, and then it produces the crazy waste that we see on the right. But it is a vital piece of economic stimulus. And understanding how throughput stimulates our economy, what that means in terms of a transition to a more sustainable economy, getting past the cultural dissonance, getting past the perversion of values that we have, the perversion of understanding of values that we have created so far, is critical for moving forward. We have another chapter on wars on drugs, terrorists, communists, witches of all sorts. Are they meant to be won or just fought? In the upper left we have the icon of the young drug dealer from the 1980s in particular. I remember this era very well because this is when I was coming of age, if you want to use that term. And Reagan came into office and repolarized the economy, cut the tax rate for the wealthiest Americans, cut social services, and lo and behold, the poverty rate started to skyrocket up. And not coincidentally, they launched a war on drugs, and the prison rate began an increase, the rate of incarceration in the United States that has continued largely unabated till now. So that young man there gets blamed for social decay. It's the young drug dealer that brought drugs into urban communities that made them fall apart, rather than the economic managers that triggered that crisis fairly systematically and purposefully for political reasons. Then we have the icon of the modern terrorist. We're fighting a war against these guys. Who are they? How do you win that war? I don't know. It's an unwinnable war. And there's Che on the right, the classic communist icon, the old witch that dates back a few decades now. The way in which stratified human cultures define evil, what is evil, is a very instructive process. I think it can be understood as a unified theory or unified understanding. It's a systematic process by which stratified human cultures define evil and choose to fight against that evil. And as we go forward and the stresses of ecological decline escalate, that witch hunting will be played out in much the same form it has in the past. It will rise and fall and rise and fall. But understanding how it's worked historically and what it's going to do going forward is very important. A very important piece of gaining control over the evolution of our own culture. Then we have another chapter that examines the question of why are we so smart in some ways and so stupid in other ways. So we can launch rocket ships into outer space. We can build electronics that boggle the mind, the first two pictures, but we are largely unconscious of our own environmental impacts as per the picture on the left, and we don't know very basic questions of why men dominate women all over the world. And there's a lot of very ugly fallout from male supremacy, if you want to use that term. But if you ask the average person on the street or even well-educated academics, well, why is male supremacy so universal? Where did it come from? Where's it going? You don't really get clear answers. I think the answers are pretty clear. They are, but you have to break through that cultural dissonance. You have to develop a different way of looking at human culture that understands the economic and ecological roots of these issues. So it begs the question, if it's possible to understand human culture in a whole new way, to understand our environmental relationships, to understand our social relationships, why don't we? Is it an accident? I think it's not an accident. I think there's a very systematic process, a systematic manipulation of human cognitive development that happens in our culture, through the school system, through other cultural institutions that we have, that manipulates cognitive development and segments social reality in such a way that we systematically choose to know some things and to not know others. A conscious human culture, a human culture that evolves on a conscious basis, is going to have to break down and remake these processes of child rearing, these processes of segmenting social reality. We're going to have to understand our social reality in a whole new way, and we're going to have to empower our children in a whole new way. We have a chapter that looks at the social sciences. The social sciences have betrayed their responsibility to examine the actual evidence of the evolution of industrial society and its ecological circumstance by doing the same thing political and religious leaders do, namely pursuing claims of false agency while studiously ignoring the evidence. The evidence in this case is specifically that many human cultures all over the world, we have a pastoralist there on the left. There are many pastoralists around the world that have lived for thousands or even tens of thousands of years in the same, well, probably not tens of thousands, but certainly thousands of years in the same area without degrading the environment. We tend to blame things like human population growth. We have a group of village children there on the left. We look at them and say, oh, too many children, too much breeding, overpopulation. We tend to point a finger at the practices of pre-industrial cultures when in fact there's many examples of pre-industrial cultures that lived sustainably. It is our culture with its mass consumption. We see one picture of the great traffic jam there on the left that has a horrific ecological record compared to most pre-industrial cultures. But the social sciences have largely chosen to ignore this cross-cultural evidence, and many environmental books and many social scientists have chosen to ignore this long record of sustainable human cultures and simply write it off as human nature. There's delayed gratification and a bunch of other terms, more modern terms, that look at this supposed tendency buried in human nature to be short-sighted while studiously ignoring the evidence of when we're not short-sighted. So we'll look at the evolution of the social sciences, what the social sciences have chosen to look at and not look at various times. So the last three chapters of the book kind of transition to looking at, okay, so we've examined the history of where these things are coming from, where they're likely going in the future. Let's talk about solutions. So we've got a chapter that looks at good environmentalism and evil environmentalism, how environmentalism is defined and why, and to whose benefit. So we have the big windmills in the sky that are going to save us all from our consumptive habits. We have plastics recycling there on the right, both of which are examples of bad environmentalism, basically, or environmentalism that has been misdirected, misfocused, and ill-defined, or defined for evil purposes. And we'll talk about what that means. And then we have real-world environmentalism, which is ordinary people. This is a shot on the bottom there of a woman from Sudan using a lovely little solar cooker. We use those solar cookers at Living Energy Farm. I cook on one of those on a fairly regular basis. So the question of how is environmentalism defined? Is it defined focusing on a cross-cultural perspective, on how villagers live, on how people live all over the world, or is it defined simply within the context of modern industrial society and trying to justify our habits? And what does that mean going forward? Where does renewable energy work? If the big windmill in the sky is not the answer, then what is the answer? Well, renewable energy does work. It works really well. Recycling does work. It works really well if applied in the right context, in the right manner, in a conscious culture, in a thoughtful manner. If it's applied wrongly, it does more harm than good. Renewable energy, supposedly, what's called renewable energy can do a lot more harm than good if it's pursued in a foolish fashion. So we'll look at that. We'll differentiate the good from the bad in terms of where we're headed going forward. How do we make it possible for humans to consciously direct their cultural evolution on a large scale? It has a lot to do with economic localization. This is the next to the last chapter in the book. We have a picture of a farmer's market. We have a picture of some local currencies there. We'll talk about local currencies, talk about economic localization and the relationship of economic localization and cultural change, building social movements, what that could look like going forward into the future. Humans are uniquely cultural beings. Anthropologists refer to the transition to cultural evolution as the Great Leap. This is the transition from evolution based primarily on biology and genetics to evolution based primarily on culture. So some animals like birds, the song of a hatchling in a nest is influenced by the song of its parents, but the basic tenor of the song is genetically encoded. The behavior is genetically encoded. Whether the bird is a eater of bugs or seeds or whatever, most of their behavior is genetically encoded. Whereas for humans, most of our behavior is culturally learned. So other animals possess a small amount of culture. Humans are the only animal on the face of the earth whose evolution is primarily cultural rather than biological. We still evolve biologically in a very slow process, but cultural evolution is a very fast process, very powerful process we have learned. And that transition from biologically based evolution to cultural evolution was called a great leap. That's one phrase that anthropologists use to refer to it. Are we capable of a second great leap to consciously directed human cultural evolution? Yes, by leading the curve of change rather than following it. And we have the curve from the Club of Rome, State of the World. It was originally republished in the 1970s. That book has been republished several times under several different titles. There's a 30-year update that was, I think, the most recent update of that book. In any case, so understanding how, first accepting and understanding how our relationship to ecology and economy influence our culture, and then looking forward, how do we lead the curve of change rather than follow it? A huge issue, and it means the difference between heaven and hell. The irony is that we are going to change a lot in the coming decades, and where we're going to end up 100 years from now, 200 years from now, in some ways is very similar, whether or not we lead the curve or follow it. Industrialism is going to go through a contraction. There's going to be a great deal of suffering, I'm afraid. We probably can't stop that. There's going to be a simplification in some ways of how we do things. But if we did it consciously, if we did it purposefully, we could go to a better place. And frankly, this problem of non-conscious evolution, of our culture being kind of purposefully made stupid and then evolving on a blind basis, is not going to be solved by the contraction itself. The coming contraction is not going to resolve that issue. We're going to go through more contractions going into the future, more boom and bust cycles, or into a state that we may not want in terms of a collapse of democracy. All of that is really unnecessary if we simply lead the curve. We can simplify or change our culture on purpose. We can take it in the same direction we're going to have to go, whether we like it or not, and just do it purposefully, and we could create a conscious culture, a culture that can evolve consciously rather than be pushed by these unseen forces of history. We could do that. It would be a kind of a second great leap. It would be a whole different form of cultural evolution, potentially. At least that's the hope, that's the vision, that's the dream. And I have no illusions about how difficult that might be to build that social movement, and I also have no illusions that it would be an inherently virtuous social movement. But nonetheless, the stakes are very high right now. We are capable of a great deal of destruction of the earth on which we live, and we could pay a terrible price for that if we don't wake up. So, Integrated Activism, the book is about, hopefully, how to start thinking about and building the social movement towards a culture that understands its linkages to economy and ecology, and then uses that understanding to build a conscious culture going forward. So we're going to go back and look at each one of these chapters, go through the book chapter by chapter with various slideshows, and we hope you'll tag along with us. Have a good day.